Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast produced by Keat TV, a PBS affiliate in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. The journey we've taken on this podcast has been a wild one, through the myth and mysteries that underlie and frame human existence, over the crumbling barricades of reductive materialism, past the crumbling one-armed statues of ancient tradition, and ever on to the rising temple on the hill. What ultimately stands as that new edifice, if anything, remains entirely up to us. We started with UFOs and the possibilities of non-human intelligence and have since been tracing the outlines of an ancient construction. So many of the patterns, the deeply set foundations of extraordinary human experience have always been there. The perennial philosophy where mind matters and matter is minded. Our guest today, author Gary Lachman, has examined the site and sifted the layers. His many books cover the events and personalities of Esoterica, drawing from these disparate sources and thought streams a detailed rendering of an ancient and entirely useful mode of thinking that I believe has great potential for helping all of us to re-enter and re-inhabit an enchanted world. After all this time, why are we as a species again flirting with such ideas? Because despite the glittery gadgets and tech we endlessly invent and acquire, ever clever humanity has seemingly locked itself alone in a meaningless universe. So, how do we break the spell? I certainly don't have the answers, but by reading the work of folks like Gary Lachman, for one, and re examining our own psyches to find once again and embrace that spark that illuminates the universe, maybe we can make a start. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So your books have been a whirlwind of inspiration for me, and I thank you for all the obviously hard work and thorough research that you've done. I know that you had another life, another career as a musician, bass player with Blondie, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess my first question is, how did you go from the role of an artist to being the role of a scholar of esoterica and what some people might consider weirdness?
Well, it both things started at the same time, more or less. I first became acquainted with and interested in the sort of thing that I've been writing about now for some years. When I first was playing with Blondie, and this is some time ago. This is 1975. Would have been around this time of year, 1975. And originally, I was living for a while with Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein in this little flat they had in Little Italy. But that we then got a loft space on the Bowery. And this is when the Bowery really was the Bowery. I mean, it was the Skid Row and all that. It was the dead end and everything. And CBGB was a block away from the loft we had. But in the loft, the fellow who had it, who rented us a floor, he was this flamboyant artist who was into Aleister Crowley. And he used to read the tarot, the Crowley Thoth Tarot deck, and he did some paintings, canvases that were based on some of those, and we had some of the books, and I started reading that. And another book I came across at the time was just called The Occult. It was by a British author, Colin Wilson, whom I later got to know and eventually would write a book about. But that's one of those books that literally changed my life. I had no interest in this sort of thing before reading that stuff. I read a lot. I was interested in existentialism and Hermann Hesse, but not magic and all that. And so that was yeah. And then I had some experiences around that time. One I turned into a song, or a series of them turned into a song. This was my girlfriend at the time and we I was on tour and she was back in New York, but we were somehow telepathically in touch. We would have the same sorts of dreams, or we would call each other. And this is when you had to go to a phone booth or a hotel phone to call.
Yeah, totally.
It's like had to work at it a bit. And that was a song called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence Dear," and that was one of Blondie's early hits. And it was after that I just started reading all this stuff. And then I mean, I left music. I had my own band for a while called The Know, KNOW. And that name came from my interest in Gnosticism, which was this ancient Well, it was like around the same time as a Christian. It was an early Christian. I was going to say variant or sect, but it may very well have been the true Christianity, and the Petron Church, the official church, may have been the one that was somehow deviant from this, but it gained power. That there's some theories about it. But Gnosticism, Gnostic means knowledge. Gnosis, it's a Greek word for a kind of knowledge, and not the knowledge you acquire through reading or experiment, or the knowledge we're used to, but this kind of sudden
illumination
right. So that was my band. And last person I played with, or group I played with Iggy Pop for a year, 2 North American tours, and that was the sex, drugs, and rock and roll tours. And I hung my Stratocaster on the wall after that, and thought I'd settle down. And then after that, I just spent quite a few years trying to find myself, basically. And I recently just been writing about this, so it's interesting. I mean, it's the same story. I always get asked, but I did say, well, actually, how did you, go from doing what you did to now and all that? So yeah.
So, and you mentioned that you had some personal experiences that sort of primed you for, at least researching the subject of sort of extra normal or para, whatever kinds of phenomenon. So was there never a barrier of belief for you in terms of, like, reading the Occult, Colin Wilson's great book? I mean, he mentions a lot of things, and his work is so great because it's so intelligently put together, but also very accessible, and you feel like it's a likable voice, and I also loved that book. And so, but basically, was there a moment where a time when you were kind of like, oh, these are entertaining ideas, but I don't know if they reflect reality, and then you were sort of converted that way? Or was that sort of something that you already had with you?
Well, I think it was sort of, what the thing about Wilson's book was that it wasn't just a book. Well, if you know it, it wasn't just a book about spells or ghosts and all that sort of thing. I didn't know at the time, but he had already a decade plus writing as an existentialist, more or less. It's his first book, which I found later on, a year or two later, The Outsider, was people like Sartre and Nietzsche and Camus, and people like that are in there. And it's I had read Nietzsche, and I read, Hesse. And I mean, I was one of these adolescents who was part of the Hermann Hesse, phenomena in the States in the 70s. He was like a best-selling author posthumously. I mean, he had already been in Germany a few times, but the hippies had discovered him. And I, a tail end kind of hippie in the early 70s, was reading him and all that. So I was primed for it in that way. But no, I just was fascinated by it, and the whole idea of, like, yeah, wow, we can do this. Yeah, that was like, I'm all. I mean, I somehow linked it to Nietzsche's Übermensch. It's like, yeah, this is what it's about. And the whole idea of creative evolution, I thought, absolutely, yeah. I was just bowled over by it. But around the same time, I discovered that I had precognitive dreams. Dreams about the future, and that came from reading a book called An Experiment with Time by a fellow named J.W. Dunn. That was published in the 1920s, but I heard about that book from reading Wilson, and basically just by chance, this guy, he wasn't an occultist, he was an aeronautics engineer, but just by chance he discovered that he bits and pieces of the future, his own personal future, not like Criswell predicts, what's going to happen. It's more like it's going to happen to him, like the next day. And long story short, he just said, if you want to find out for yourself, because he believed this was probably true of everyone, that he wasn't just some freak, just write your dreams down. So I just started doing that, and yeah, he was right. And eventually I wrote a book about it that came out a couple of years ago. It's called Dreaming Ahead of Time.
Yeah.
And it's about,
I haven't read that one, but that's
about precognition in general. But it's there's one chapter is just my own, from my own journals, which I've kept on and off since that would have been about 1980, when I first started writing my dreams down, and realized that I had, oh my God, this has really happened. And so I just, okay, well, and then synchronicities, things like that. And so I just felt like, okay, if I approach this as a phenomenologist, I mean, I later learned that word. I wasn't saying this to myself back when I was a rocker in 1980, but I was saying, this is just what happened, just describe it, and I read up on the subject, and there's, quite a few different theories about how it might happen and so on and so on. And, retrocognition and all this sort of thing. And there are some, I think, are they the positrons? I forget which particle it is that, apparently for some infinitesimal bit of time does go backwards or something.
Was that tachyons, maybe, or
maybe it's the tachyons? Yeah.
One of those.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so in any case, but so yeah, I just thought, okay, and then but just, I mean, it wasn't until many years later that I started writing. I started the first things.
You're so good at it. I mean, that's not to blow your horn or anything, but you were obviously a famous musician, and then you turn your hand at writing, and you're also very good at that. So,
well, it took me I had to learn how. I mean, the music, it kind of just came out. I mean, but when I had to actually learn how to write, so it took a very long time. So when I retired from music, say about 1982. I had the great luxury of not having to, do anything at all for a while. I earned some money, and the next career move, I thought I was going to teach philosophy. That's what I was going to do. I went back to university and I got a degree in philosophy, thinking I was going to wind up teaching philosophy. But I enjoyed getting my undergraduate. But when I wound up going to graduate school, not in philosophy, actually, I went to graduate school for English. And I spent quite a few years in the wilderness trying to find myself, and I just found it was utterly just uncongenial. Then I worked for quite a few years at a metaphysical bookshop, in New Age bookshop, very famous one at the time, called the Bodhi Tree in West Hollywood, and it was put on the map in the 80s by Shirley MacLaine. I don't know if that name still rings a bell anymore.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
back in the day. But she got into past lives and crystals and her aura and all that sort of thing. And this bookshop had been there since the early 70s. The story is that the people who started it, they worked for Lockheed, and then they decided, they were Buddhists, and they decided they wanted to do something more meaningful. So they opened it wasn't called a New Age just yet then. I guess it was a metaphysical bookshop. It was a great place. And but after this, Shirley MacLaine got interested in it. She wrote a book, and then there was a TV miniseries where she mentions the shop, and then suddenly it was like everybody, everybody from Orange County and points, west wanted to come and check out the auras and all that. And I started working then. Yeah. So that would have been in 1987. So I'm working a degree in philosophy, and I'm studying Wittgenstein and Hegel. And then the other time I'm in this New Age bookshop, and I'm showing people, how to do the tarot and getting the right crystal for them and all that sort of thing. So I had sort of both.
Yeah, well, and you've ultimately developed right into that's sort of your pocket, right? I mean,
so it's more or less. I mean, I was trying to make sense of it. So it took a long time. And some rather drastic life changes that the denouement of which had me moving to London from Los Angeles in the early 1996, and I've been here since then. And it was then that I said, okay, now it's do or die. So I'm going to make a living as a writer or not. And so, sorry for your audience, but knock on wood. It's been good so far, yes. But it took a long time. I really had to learn how to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that I mean, most things of value, especially if they're developing out of an inner, search, maybe do take time. And if although, that's not always true necessarily, but so, you were a musician, and there's a lot of people talk about that sort of spiritual aspect of music, and especially of performance, where there's a connection that happens with people, and that it draws to certain creative types who have that sort of aspect to their personality. Did you ever feel that sort of the spiritual connection in performing and with the crowd, or was that before you really started to think about those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't have called it spiritual in the sense that you certainly on a good night, the band either, with playing in Blondie than playing with my own band. When I played guitar and I wrote the songs and sang, so that was a different thing too. So I was more of me invested in it at the time. But on a good night when you gel and it's something new and unique and unrepeatable happens, and then you have a good audience. So you get that. What do you want to call it? It's a kind of Dionysian sense of somehow you've transcended your individual kind of identities briefly and your part. But it's not necessarily one mind, but it's kind of like you're in the moment, and there's a larger kind the energies from everyone else around you.
Someone else had pointed out to me that it's also like a ritual in a way, like the band members playing the songs, they're doing the same thing that they've done in rehearsal and over practice and in previous performances. So they're effectively doing a ritual, and it creates this sort of, like you were saying, overarching identity of the crowd who is united in that experience at least. And so there are, I'm discovering that there's some magical elements in a lot of things that we typically take for granted in life, that have aspects that may be at least part of the reason why they are so effective at impacting human psychology. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, in recent years, I know in the art world, there was a rise of what's called occulture. And I guess most broad way of thinking about it is to say any kind of culture that has some kind of occult element in it, and likewise any sort of occult practice that is incorporating some arts or drama or something like that. But I mean, there are those sort of parallels. I mean, there is a certain artistic character to performing, say, a classic ritual, and just as you might say, there is this ritual aspect to doing the artwork. But then I guess one of the crossover areas is what's called chaos magic, which is kind of like found art in a way. So I picked this up in the street and I take it home, and now it's on the mantelpiece and it is now art. Whereas I transformed it from some everyday sort of thing, mundane thing, into now it's an object of interest in some way. And chaos magic, and again, a very broad sense, it doesn't stick to all the traditional impedimenta and rituals of uses whatever at hand. So there's a crossover there and all that kind of thing. So I think you can find, and throughout the literature there's so many references to art, and the magician and the artist, they're both sort of doing, and I would say where that really in a broad sense, if you look at the sort of symbolist poets, or someone like Rimbaud, and then later the symbolist art around that time, leading up to the fin de siècle. I mean, there was a lot of that, and great deal of but it's interesting to me that around the same time it seemed like the art world was sort of rediscovering the occult. That was happening in the academic world as well. But I think for both, though, 20 years earlier, or even whatever, it wouldn't have touched it. It would have. This is just.
Yeah.
So and I in a way, I kind of like, oh, finally they got around. There was nothing left. What was left for them? They had to discover this now. So both in the art world and the academic world, when the contemporary interest in the occult for both now. I don't know. I mean, I guess that started. I mean, when did that start up? Sometime in the 90s, or no? Actually, more recent. I mean, let's say 40 years ago, it wouldn't be.
Not at all.
They wouldn't be touching it, So, but now it just struck me as like, they ran out of things. Both, you have to have new thesis fodder, and you have to have some new
something new to deconstruct,
some subject for, So, and it's always something that the previous generation didn't recognize the value of. So it's the previous generation's trash. You idiots! You didn't see how fantastically fascinating this is. So.
Now, one of the things I've enjoyed most about your work is how you chart the sort of the evolution of consciousness, like talking about how the axial age, when humanity was sort of blessed with a lot of sort of strong, charismatic personalities who brought a spiritual message. And then, over time, as you talk about it in the Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, basically we start to switch over, and then the church and the budding science sort of teamed up to form a partnership that stripped the world of qualitative experience and started to focus on the quantitative. On that larger continuum, do you think that we are as a species actually evolving into something different and better on some sort of like purposeful course, or is that sort of just the happenstance of where reality goes? I mean, I know that in your books you mentioned Gene Gebser and the aperspectival consciousness that he mentions, and then at one point you write about I think it's Petrarch on the mountain when he sees for the first time the view from the top and has the spatial awareness sort of open up for him, and that maybe later helps lead to perspective and painting. But do you see how is that happening in a purposeful way, or is it all accidental into your mind?
Well, I mean, with Gebser, I mean, he's charting what he calls structures of consciousness. Yeah, I mean, the example you just gave of the Italian poet Petrarch, he climbs Mont Ventoux, the windy mountain, basically. It's on the route of the Tour de France now, but apparently he was the first person to climb a mountain just to see the view.
Yeah.
People had to climb mountains, but it was not something, hey, honey, let's go climb the mountain. And he tells a story as he goes up, there's some farmer who's, no, don't go there. You will meet with death and danger and horrible stuff. And so, but the point is that Petrarch's on top of the mountain, suddenly he sees vast distances, around him and 360 and sort of thing. And before then, Gebser argues that sort of the world was seen more as like a tapestry, and the medieval way of being was somehow you were part of that tapestry. And we talk about the tapestry of nature and all that. And so, but then suddenly that becomes 3D, and that's the beginning of the real space age. The Sputnik going out in space is the result of that finally. So he marshals enormous amount of what he would say evidence or suggestions or references in a variety of things, and to these different structures. And there's different other philosophers as well. And so I mean, personally, I think there's some kind of intelligence at work. What is it exactly? I can't say. I mean, that's why I read all these things and I write these books trying to in some way get a handle on it. I've come to feel it's a pointless argument. Is it meaningless? Is it meaningful? Do we have free will? Do we not? It's like, just get on with it and see what happens, because you're not gonna, you're never gonna argue to answer that. And I think in a way, perhaps that may be done on purposely
no,
as well,
absolutely,
to leave us in this kind of state of like uncertainty, because
seeking, because you're always looking
we're in that
for
state.
something.
We make efforts in some way. And perhaps in some way reality depends on us, maybe rather than the sense that there's it already there waiting for us to finally get to it, maybe through our efforts to penetrate the veil, as it were, of what we don't understand. Maybe that in some way, maybe that in some way creates it, not necessarily in some master design knowing exactly what's going to happen, but the sheer kind of effort of trying to plumb the depths of the mystery around us. I mean, I have to say, I mean, I don't remember when it happened, but sometime when I was fairly young, I remember just thinking, why doesn't anybody know exactly why we're here and why everything is here? And how could it be the case? And wouldn't it be the strangest possible thing that it just happened by chance? And then I remember thinking like, well, but isn't chance something that's part of this world that's here already? So it, I mean, it couldn't have happened by chance, because chance didn't exist until this world happened. So just finding myself, as an adolescent, thinking like these kinds of thoughts, and this is sort of like primed me for reading existentialism and stuff like that. But it is, I mean, you have to say, it is one of the strangest things. We really have no, idea in the sense, people talk about, we live in a simulation and all that. And I always want to say, a simulation of what?
Yeah,
because you have to have the original to know whether this is the simulation or not. So, in any case, this is metaphysics 101. But
yeah.
yeah, no.
I mean, I appreciate that everything that you just said especially in terms of the seeking. One of the things I enjoyed most about your book on Jung, which was that it focused less on what he teaches or the dogma, but more on his own role as a seeker, which I thought was really fascinating. And toward the later end of his career, you talk about how people went from coming to him to get treated for illnesses and rather came to him to sort of get examples of how to live. He became more of a teacher or a seer rather than the psychoanalyst. And I thought that was really important. And part of what, like when I in the intro, I was mentioning that we've locked ourselves in a meaningless universe. Part of that is by stripping the world of meaning and focusing on things like scientism or whatever else. We've basically bifurcated ourselves and left half of who we are out in the cold. And so we're never fully embracing reality with both aspects of who we are, and that's a lonely place to be.
Oh
So
yeah, no. I think no,
it's
you're
absolutely
absolutely right.
important.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's well, that's one of the things. Just because we mentioned Gebser, that's one of the things he would say has happened during the time of the present structure of consciousness, which he calls the mental rational,
Yeah.
which gets going back in the Greek time, the axial age, which is sort of this. We're around the globe. You have there's Lao Tse and Confucius, the Buddha, the Hebrew patriarchs, Zoroaster, all kind of appearing within the same, give or take a century or two on either side, sort of around 500 BC, either side of that.
Yeah.
But in the Mediterranean world, in Greece, you have the rise of what is rational inquiry, whereas it's sort of Thales is usually considered the first philosopher, although that term wasn't coined until Pythagoras a bit later. But he's the first one. He wasn't. This was a shift from the mythic way of talking about the world. Why is the world the way it is? Oh well, when this god did this and this happened, that's why this is here. So you had a story. You told a story and it explained things. He said, well, I don't, that's fine. I don't want to know. I want to know, what is that rock made of? What's the stuff? Is there some basic stuff that it's made of? And so he comes to think it's water, and others say it's fire and air. It's all that elemental sort of thing. But it's the beginning of what we later would know as philosophy, but then branching off into science. And this was much was gained by that, but at a price. And as you say, we over many years and centuries of developing this method of rational inquiry, and this is the other kind of knowledge, the episteme, study, experiment, doubt, and all, finding some nugget of certainty and all that. We've, as we say, and well, it's the whole notion of the disenchantment of the world, or the great Pan is dead. The end of the notion of the world as being in some way kind of living, sentient being, let's say, in some way responsive, to human, interaction in some way. No, it's a dead kind of machine sort of thing, and it obeys these laws. And look what we can do with them, and we can do a heck of a lot. We can send satellites out to who knows where. I mean, our conception of the universe is like, my God, it's like completely, as should we say, beyond anything that people at earlier centuries might have, they got burned at the stake for it. Giordano Bruno, the whole idea of infinite worlds and all that. It's like, no,
for even suggesting such things. Yeah.
So we do live in a very, very different kind of world, and also with the increasing, what do you want to call it, tech, that more and more becomes second nature, to us. So it's it's interesting. It's an interesting time. But I mean, for people like Gebser's and others, they would say that that mental rational structure, which was necessary, for the many good things that have come with it, and also our sense of independence, being able to think for ourselves. Um, it's hypertrophied. It's things that start out as an asset become a deficit. So they get too ripe, they get overripe. So, and what we're experiencing, Gebser died in 1973, and he said he believed that what was beginning was what he called the breakdown of the mental rational structure. And this was necessary in order for this next structure, which you call the integral, which I can't go into, but it is sort of it integrates these previous consciousness structures, and it's more holistic.
Kind of a both and
it includes all these meaning, and the sorts of things that, in order for the science to work, it had to cut out any of that kind of stuff. It had to, in order to know the laws of planetary motion, you had to kick the angels off the planets. So can we have both? I mean, I one of the things I say in different books is that, although the rational mind at different times has said it's finally got rid of all the superstitious nonsense, it keeps coming back in different ways. And if you don't integrate it in a creative way, it's going to come back in another way. And in more recent times, I would say that's happened on the world stage, with a kind of occult politics that turned up around Trump and around Putin. And I've written about that in other books as well. So, I mean, that was one of the weirdest things for me in recent times, where all the stuff that for me was always on the fringe and you had to go out of your way to find, suddenly it's almost like
well, that's what I mean. I wanted to ask you very much about that, because I haven't read that book yet, and part of it's because I have a little bit of Trump exhaustion. During his presidency, I spent, way too much time watching cable news and trying to find out ways to fight what I thought was the bad things that were happening. But I had that had occurred to me in some ways that there was some occultish roots, and I know that some of the people who followed Trump and were behind his ascendancy, think in this way. But can you explain for folks what you recognized in the Trump administration or around Trump that was occultish in a way that we could recognize?
All right. Well, I mean, there were several different things. I mean, Trump himself was a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking, which is a kind of Christianized form of mental science. Thoughts are things, and that's where he gets the idea, this phrase that facts don't matter. It's how you interpret the facts. So this was something that Peale, talked about. And this whole idea of focusing the mind on the goal, completely on the goal, ignoring everything else, and a kind of creative tunnel vision, all that. So that itself is linked to, this whole kind of mental science, new thought, Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, Vernon Howard, and then, I forget, in recent times, there was a book called The Secret. That was like, the
law of attraction kind of thing.
Popular,
right?
Law of attraction, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's Trump himself. Okay. And then Steve Bannon, who was on his team at the time, he was a reader of Julius Evola. And who's Julius Evola? Julius Evola was a 20th century Italian esoteric thinker who had very, very far right political views. I mean, he's technically didn't join the fascist party, but he didn't run away from it either. He tried to ingratiate himself with National Socialists, and he had some influence on Mussolini. But he belonged to a school of esoteric thinking known as traditionalism. And it's a kind of, put it simply, it's a sort of fundamentalist esotericism. And it's the idea that at the basis of all religions, there's a basic, primal revelation that was bequeathed to man from the divine. And all the great religious traditions started at that, but they deviated from it. And the whole notion that, we're downhill, we're in the Kali Yuga, we're in the Iron Age, the Golden Age, way back when, and things, and now it's horrible. So the person who sort of got that going is a Frenchman named René Guénon, who starts writing about in the 1920s and all that. And he's happy to wait on the sidelines for the West to decline and to go down. But Evola was much more active. He was much more military kind of character. And after the war, or World War II, he was sort of this eminence grise behind several neo-fascist movements in Italy. And he wrote a book called Revolt Against the Modern World. And the whole idea is that nothing in the modern world is in any way good. And it's not a sense of reform in any way. It's just destroy it.
Yeah.
Everything is a target. And so Bannon was reading this guy. And also, if you remember the alt-right, they were very popular once. No, I don't hear anything about them anymore. They
kind of
for a
have
while
disappeared,
for a while they were almost like on GQ. They were sort of like, they made it look like almost really cool to be, very
Yeah, the whole Proud Boy aesthetic, right? I mean,
yes.
like
But Richard Spencer was ahead of them, and other guys. They were readers of this guy Evola as well, and he was like one of the intellectuals to so they could tell just from sort of skinhead, racist and stuff like that. And so you got that. And then but those guys, they claim to have used the internet to help Trump win the election. And this how I wound up writing the book about Trump, Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump.
And I'll have a link in the description for that.
Yeah.
For people. Yeah.
This is my commercial voice. But right after the election, Spencer was the head of something called the National Policy Institute, and they had their annual meeting in Washington. And he came into it and he said, "Hail Trump, hail our leader. We made this happen. We made this dream come true." And this was all on CNN in the regular news, and everybody, the guys at the meeting were given the salute as well and all that kind of stuff. But this got picked up by someone who writes about New Thought. And this sounds like they're practicing some kind of New Thought magic. We will this to happen, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns into such an absurd long story, which in some ways makes sense because it's involved with chaos magic and all that. But they claim to have used the internet, to by posting memes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember Pepe the Frog?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Pepe the Frog. So by Pep, I'm glad I don't have to explain. The other day, a German radio journalist interviewed me, and he asking me questions, and I don't think he knew this, and I found myself trying to briefly explain who Pepe the Frog was, and all that. I don't think he verstehen.
Yeah.
But in any case, so if you know the story, Pepe starts out as an innocuous slacker amphibian,
Mm-hmm.
and he's just a cartoon kind of character. And people like Katy Perry and other, pop stars at the time were, memeing him and blah, blah, blah. But he gets picked up by the alt-righters and these kind of miscreants on 4chan and other kind of websites who posting all this weird stuff. And people on that 4chan, it's all this backstory, which makes it such a long thing. But they believe that stuff that they were posting on 4chan is making stuff happening in the real world. Okay. They were posting stuff, then they started to see, oh my God, we posted this, and then that happened. And it started with the Germanwings crash, where that was preceded by them posting lots of scenes from the Batman film where who's the guy, the big evil guy?
The Joker?
No, the big strong has the thing. I forget. He's supposed to be being taken to prison, but he's actually Bane. That's his name.
Bane. Okay.
Bane. He's supposed to be being taken to prison, but actually he's in charge, and he winds up killing the pilot and crashing the plane and all that. Yeah. And they really liked that scene for some reason, so they posted that, and then not long after them posting it a lot, the Germanwings thing happened. And there seems to be a lot of parallels between that scene and where the plane crashed, and names and all that kind of stuff. It's all in the book.
Yeah.
So they thought, wow, if this could happen by chance, what if we wanted to make something happen? So they called this Synchro Mysticism, which was like a internet upgrade of synchronicity. Yeah. So if you think of the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination.
Yeah.
Is the way I think of it,
Yeah.
With the synchronicity, something going on inside your head, you're concerned about thinking about, you see it out in the world, and in such a way that it seems this could not, this, somebody knows what I'm thinking.
That happens to me all the time, and I'm sure to
that is
everyone
so, yeah,
else.
well,
It's like, are the advertisers listening to what I'm saying or whatever, you know?
All right. Okay, so just take that from here to the outer world, from the internet to the outer world. And so they started posting all these things with Pepe in it, and Pepe and Trump, and Pepe looking over the Mexican wall, and you know, Pepe with the deplorables and all this kind of thing. And then they claimed that somehow that seeped, you know, the simulacra seeped from, you know, the internet, which in a way you could also think of as a kind of techno astral light. Let's say, you know, the magicians, the occult is astral light, which is this ether-like medium that the will and the imagination of the magician, you know, works on, you know, so
manifests
through that.
Yeah.
All right. So if you think the internet in some way is that. So any case, so this is what the alt-writers and the fellow travelers on 4chan are basically saying, that they somehow, you know, they affected something. And so that was something else. And then the whole backdrop to this was all about the barrier between reality and fantasy, you know, or the truth and the simulation of being completely permeable.
Yeah.
You know, what's the most popular thing on television? Reality, right? All right.
Yeah.
And then there's so much reality on TV now that this the way I was thinking it to myself is that there was not enough space, so something had to move, and so something popped up out of the TV into reality, and that was Trump, because Trump, you know, was the apprentice for a long time, and he wore the suit, the power suit, and he hired and fired, and he was generous and, you know, very magnanimous, and he was, you know, cruel and punishing, and so he sort of primed himself for the role of the president that way. And there was a book in the, I think it was written in the 40s by a fellow named Siegfried Krakauer. It's called From Caligari to Hitler. It was about the German films prior to the rise of National Socialism. So if you know the German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or Dr. Mabuse, or these other ones where there's this kind of mastermind behind things, controlling events. And his thesis, Krakauer's thesis, was that those kind of films primed the German people for the rise of Hitler, for some kind of, you know, demagogue character. So, you know, you take that as a, you know, pinch of salt, but I thought, oh, that's an interesting, so, you know, so, and then even in the academic world, you have the whole notion of, you know, postmodernism, where there's no more reality with a capital R or truth with a capital T. It's all relative. It's all, you know, it's and that's why we find ourselves today with the whole notion of everything being a social construct, and all that. So it just struck me from very different avenues. They all converge on this notion of reality being malleable. You know, and that was happening in Russia too. You know, at the same, with I mean, there's a chapter in there about the people around Putin earlier in, say, in the 2000, 2010, up to then. This guy named Vladimir Surkov, who sort of ran the control board for all of the media throughout Russia, and so created, you know, this kind of simulation of a democracy. He called it planned democracy. So they had kind of invented, you know, discussions and, you know, protests, like staged protests and things like that, to give the impression of, so, and again, one more figure behind that is this character named Alexander Dugin.
Yes, I've heard that name before.
You know, he's been tagged as Putin's Rasputin, but, you know, there you go. But he's someone who's a reader of this Julius Evola. He's a chaos magician himself. He's had the strangest, you know, trajectory of a political figure. He started out in the 1980s as a, you know, anti-Soviet dissident punk, and got arrested for singing anti-Soviet songs. And now he lectures on geopolitics to the Kremlin. And in between that to that, he sort of did this mix and match kind of postmodern ideological kind of sort of quick change act, where he would Velcro together bits and pieces of different totalitarian or authoritarian, political structures. Because for him, the only political social system or idea that is completely useless and horrible is democracy. And so that's the evil that has to be, because it's responsible for the globalization of the planet. And he's another one who stands up for tradition. And so Russia is the last bastion of the great, traditionalists, traditional family values, traditional gender roles, traditional sexual roles, and all that kind of stuff. And
there was
will not give way to the dissolving, forces of the mercantile, West and all this sort of thing. So.
Yeah, there was that affinity that's been remarked on before between the right in America and increasingly toward the Christian, conservatives in Russia, and whether it's about arms, freedom of arms, or faith, or whatever else. I mean, I find it interesting that people will go to like gun rights rallies in Russia from America, where in Russia, I don't think you can walk around with an AR-15 on the street, but they fabricate similarities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, and I did a later book after about a year or two after the book called The Return of Holy Russia. And I did it mostly because I had a lot of material left over on Russia from the Trump book.
Yeah.
And I wound up writing a history of Russia, which I didn't want to start out wanting to do, but I myself found it so fascinating because I didn't know much about it. I knew about the Bolsheviks and stuff like that, but I didn't know a lot, and I just found their whole history, fascinating. And but the theme running through it is there's this mystical, religious, spiritual element that's at the heart of Russian society. Or it starts well, there's the Slavic pagan roots, and then they convert to Greek Orthodox Christianity in the 10th century, and then they later become it's Holy Russia in the 19th century. It's like, it's the savior of Europe. They defeat, with the help from the winter, but they defeat Napoleon. And Putin has been making gestures toward that pre-Bolshevik history, that pre-Bolshevik character of Russia as being, again, this last bastion of the true faith. And also, they have just some very, very strange ideas there. It's like they think in a very different way. I mean, there's always been Westernized Peter the Great, Catherine the Great to some degree, and then even today there's Navalny, there's Westernizers more or less, or people that say no, we're part of Europe, we're not, but they say no, we're not Europe, we're a completely different civilization. It's this whole notion that Russia is not now just another country, it's the beginning of this new civilization that they call Eurasia, and the West is going down.
That's the narrative that they're trying to.
So they're rising up, and so it's like, this whole metaphysical kind of geopolitics.
Yeah, and that can be potentially really deadly. I mean, when you combine those two things, I mean, obviously, that's been behind some of the biggest bloodbaths in history. My question is, if there's truth to this, and I believe there is. I mean, like you were talking about, I think that what we saw during the 2016 election was outlandishly startling when, like, all of a sudden Trump, who was going to lose, does win, but by a hair's breadth, and only does so in these strips of Michigan and Pennsylvania. And it just seems so unlikely. And then it manifested itself. How do we fight that? I mean, what do you do as someone who is opposed to those sorts of things? I mean, not to say on a political level, but just even a moral level. How can you begin to, what do you do if that's the case?
Well, I guess it's it's a subset of the general question: how do you live a good life, or moral, ethical life? But I know it's difficult. It's difficult in dark times. In some ways, you could say, or in many ways, people who feel that they are resisting that, they create a whole other set of kind of problems, so it becomes polarized.
Sure.
And I think it's difficult to walk a middle path without either I don't know, feeling like you're not doing anything, you're just sitting it out. And I don't know, try to speak the truth, just, fight off post truth and alternative facts and all that sort of thing. But it's difficult. I mean, we live in a time where everything is plausible and nothing's definite, but it could be a positive thing too, in the sense that, okay, it could be fertile ground for new sorts of ideas, again, getting back to Gebster, sort of the kind of rational, logical mind that, created the modern world has been kind of taking itself apart. We've seen that, if I said, even at the heart of it, with deconstructionism and postmodernism and things like that, the big ideologies, the big narratives have all been shown or believed to have been shown to be empty and all that, and they're being deconstructed, and it's on a smaller level, although we're all supposed to think globally, though, about the whole planet, things of that sort. So, we're hit with what are they calling it? The poly crisis? I don't know. There's a new name for things. I can't keep up anymore. There's a new name for there's a new ITI or an IST or something, and I don't know anymore myself. But I do think, well, one of the things Gebser said is that one sign of the change is what he called the eruption of time, with an I, not eruption like volcano, and this is somehow time's going to break in more into everyday life. And I thought things like, podcasts.
Yeah.
And it used to be called TiVo. I don't know what it is now, but whatever it is, when I was growing up, if I wanted to watch something on television, I had to be at a certain place at a certain time.
Yeah.
I had to be at those points on the Cartesian grid,
Yeah.
The TV show I wanted to watch was on then. I had to be there was home in front of the TV set at that time that it was on. Now you can watch whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want.
Yeah.
So that whole notion of being, fixed on that grid, of being someplace at a certain time in order to, get into the current, the flow, the stream, it's different. And I mean, my sons have grown up with that, so that doesn't mean anything to them. But for me, I can really see. And I think when you can notice things on that sort of banal level, that's a stronger argument for than some, big metaphysical, event taking place, because it's sort of like, it actually, that has happened, and other things like that as well. But I don't know, it's stay as conscious as you can.
Yeah.
And keep the faith, baby, as they used to say. I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen in November, and
I don't either. And it's part of the reason why I say now, looking back, that there seems to be something charmed about Trump is because of the way that he's managed to avoid accountability and keep going. And it does seem as if there is some sort of energy around that guy that
that's the power
is impervious to logic, and maybe it's just his own mindset, and like you said, get that tunnel vision on and nothing else matters, so you don't hear the critiques and you don't hear the accusations, you just keep bowling forward. But no matter what, it's demonstrating the power of a mindset, we've seen it before, but we got away from it.
I mean, he also knows he has many people, behind him and supporting him as well. So he's not, it hasn't quite, the people haven't left the ship, the sinking ship yet. It hasn't got to that. In fact, I mean, I'm not following it, but it's on the news here. And some people have been saying, well, this trial is happening. This could be something that's very, very good for him. This could make him seem like, it is true. They are trying to,
persecute me, or
so it's like, so who knows? But any case, but I mean, but I think it's good to recognize these sorts of things happening, because it's on a different terrain as well now, through the internet, through all the tech that's part of our life, and increasingly, we are engaging with this, and it's a kind of it's a what do you want to call it? It's a sort of competition for attention. So absolutely. I think that's this is area that could be colonized, in different ways, maybe already. I don't know. It's funny you started out talking about UFOs, because I started just rereading a book by Colin Wilson. He wrote maybe early late 90s called Alien Dawn. And it's one of these books where
Yeah, I've read just read that one.
he
Yeah.
reads how fun, how fun. There you go, synchronicity. He
Yeah,
reads
yeah.
everything that's out at the time about it and says, well, this is what it seems like to me. And I always like that because then I can check, okay, which of those books I'll read myself. But I
Yeah.
thought it was funny you started that because I had just my I just picked it off the shelf. So I'll read this one.
So, I mean, that's a great way to make the turn, though. What are your thoughts? I mean, you obviously have been around the last 5 years, and there's been this bubbling up of the conversation. And I started out with like, okay, shiny objects in the sky, and then it opens up into what to me seems like, in a lot of ways, at least, with some experiencers, that there is an eruption of the spiritual, I guess you'd say. Like it functions as a call to action from what you might think of as a spiritual or imaginal realm. And in that way, it's similar, if not exactly the same, as a lot of mysticism. But what are your thoughts? I mean,
well, I myself haven't had any kind of experience. I mean, I've seen something slide, and I didn't know what it was, but it was like that. But I know people who have.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, David Moore, who's wrote a book about UFOs, is what he calls evolutionary metaphors, and that's the name of the book. It's called Evolutionary Metaphor, and I don't know if it's self-published, but it came out a couple of years ago. But Jeffrey Kripal.
Yes, I had him on last week, actually.
Okay, well, I don't know him, but we've met, and but I know he's someone who's had an experience like that and had profound effect on him. And then someone else I know on the other side here in London, a fellow named Mark Pilkington, who did a book called Mirage Men. And then there was a film about it as well, where if I remember correctly, he says, yes, there was a cover up, but it's not about aliens. It's about, government, experimental.
Yeah. But he exposed a lot of really bizarre things about how the government manipulates the truth. And the idea was they were trying to cover up a particular thing at an Air Force base in the Southwest, and they were manipulating a guy to sort of further that story. He ends up committing suicide. I mean, it's a mess. And it gets back to like, if they're not lying about UFOs, I mean, or covering up UFOs, they're covering up something, and that act is feeding the whole thing, makes it so much worse.
Yeah, it's true. But I'm willing to believe people have had these sorts of experiences, and again, I think the sheer weight of like the number of course, it's probably a good number of people who just whatever, they turn some simple thing into something else, but but I'm because I've had other sorts of experiences like precognitive dreams and synchronicities and some telepathic things. I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. So but I would be more inclined that there's a kind of psychic.
Exactly. That's where I'm at.
What is it called? What's that book? Ian Watson. Something Visitors. I can't remember. It's a science fiction novel. Let me turn around. I can see. It's called Miracle Visitors.
Okay.
And so it's a novel, but it's based about UFO encounters.
Okay.
And Ian Watson is the writer's name.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
I read it years ago, but one of the things I think he was saying in the book is that it was consciousness itself was somehow creating these sorts of things. Yeah. So we think of consciousness as something we have. Like I've got a pint of consciousness in my head.
Yeah.
But it's actually it may be something in itself.
Yeah.
Again, this is like like Gebser's structures. It may have its own kind of development or something like that. And this is a sort of, in some ways, it's sort of like the Jacques Vallée idea that it's something about it's something about the effect it has on people. Maybe what's the most important thing about it,
Sure. Yeah. That's often what I think, because the people that have these experiences a lot of the time end up on a spiritual transformative journey where they start getting into things like the perennial philosophy or the occult, all the things that you write about. Like your books are kind of like the level 2 of the experiencer, like evolution, it seems like, because most people I've talked to, they have their experience, and if it turns that way, then they fall off into the research, and there's
Mm-hmm.
just so much of it that leads back to ultimately Plato's idealism or something like that, where the
Well, that's as it should be. I mean,
yeah,
that's happened to me. I mean, I just found it more. The more I read, the more I wanted to know about things. And then,
yeah,
I mean, I've tried different things. I mean, I've been involved, with different practices and over the years. And um, it's when it has that crackle of reality, that texture of reality to your experience, then you say, okay, well, I know I know that I've had precognitive dreams in the same way that I know anything else that I know.
yeah,
It's just,
exactly right.
no,
Yeah,
at this point, no one's going to talk me out of it and say I somehow misunderstood, this phenomena happening over, 40 years or something like that. And I'm not going around with a big banner saying I see the future, because I only notice it when it happens. So I
yeah,
can't tell you when it's going to happen, but when it does, it does. And so I just know. So reality is such that happens,
yes, absolutely.
and likewise with the synchronicity. So reality is such that these sorts of things happen. So what does that say?
Yeah,
Well, I can exclude certain accounts of reality that doesn't allow for those things, so I don't have to pay attention to them.
exactly right. Yeah,
That's
that's
one
not the
thing
whole
I
truth
do.
anyway.
So
Yeah, yeah,
materialism, all this sort of thing that just doesn't allow for this. Okay, well, you make a good argument, but I mean, this happened last year. I'm referencing it because it came up in a Twitter exchange or an X exchange. And I was in a place called Hay on Wye, which is on the border between Wales and England. And there's something called How the Light Gets In Festival.
hmm
And it's put on by, there's a group called the Institute of Art and Ideas. And so they got, they had a bunch of like scientists, and they had some, I don't know, not mystics, but more open. So people like Rupert Sheldrake, or Ian McGilchrist, who's writing about the right and left brain and all that sort of thing.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I was in there on something as well, and a bunch of other people. But I was paired with I think it was a scientist or philosopher of mine, but an academic fellow, nice guy, and all that. But
hmm
his basic take was, no, you must, it's paranormal is a misunderstanding, because these things just can't happen. And I
yeah,
said, well, I'm sorry, I've had precognitive dreams for the last 40 years, and I've written a book
yeah.
about it. He very kindly listened to me. Then he said, well, I can understand that you felt you had dreams. And I said, no, excuse me, I did not feel that I had precognitive dreams. And then the
Yeah,
moderator just cut it off, that it wouldn't let it continue. So, but
yeah,
but I didn't wasn't what I want to get into, a Donnybrook with him. But I just said, well, it's got nothing to do with my feeling that I did. I mean, it's
yeah.
and I can show you the journals. I can show you the journals from 1990 where I talk about a particular dream,
Yeah,
and I can show you the journal 1994 when the experience that I had dreamt about 4 years earlier took place.
yeah,
So I have, unless you're going to say I somehow doctored, the journals as well. So any case, I mean, so the world is such that these things happen.
yeah. And I mean, I think that there's such that's fundamentally what's at issue here is that I mean, with materialists, like you may have evidence to present about something that's paranormal or out of the ordinary range of what we experience, but they won't even engage with it in a serious way, because before they get into the discussion, they say these things don't happen because that's impossible, and that's their starting point. So they'll never get to a place where they're willing to open-mindedly consider whatever the
Yeah.
evidence is,
No, I mean, it's true, because you'll be considered simple-minded, or you've gone
Yeah.
soft, or you're senile, or you have, um, you have to make sure you got your tenure first, secure your tenure before you can
Yes.
or anything like that. So it's it's just it's a shame, but it is the case. But it is, anyone who, like Gary Lachman, he's constantly being sort of dragged out as a kind of whipping boy for, like, oh, he used to be a good scientist, but now he's just gone so soft and all this kind of stuff. And he had the whole exchange with, I think it was Dawkins,
Yeah.
where he said, I have all this evidence, why don't you look at it? I said, no, it's not evidence, so I'm not going
Yeah.
to waste my time looking at it. So it's like, I mean, to me, this is the same thing as the churchmen who refused to look through Galileo's telescope.
Exactly
How do
right.
I know you haven't put those moons inside there? How do I know you haven't done something to it? Just look through it. No, so it's the same. It's scientism. It's a
Yeah.
dogma. It's not.
Yeah.
And again, it's another battle of reality now. It's like, reality's up for grabs. you
Yeah.
know.
Well, that's the other thing too. It's like how we look at reality shapes how we experience reality. So we're constantly constructing as well as experiencing. And which world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world that's meaningless, where all values are relative, which I mean, I guess allows for a certain guarantee of equality, but sometimes that equality is equally bereft in a way. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and
Well, I mean,
yeah,
but it's only kind of utilitarian values or personal, it's subjective. It's like, yes,
sure.
you can say X is Y,
Hmm.
and we'll, assure you the right to do that, even though, most of us know X is really isn't Y. But well, you can you can say that, and sort of an it's but that's just you. That's you just deciding that. It isn't an objective kind of fact. The only objective things are quantitative things. I
Yeah.
mean, that's one of the, people talk about black holes and stuff like that, and I think, forget them. I mean, the most mysterious thing in the universe is us.
Yeah,
We are the
absolutely.
problem here. We're the problem because we can explain everything else in terms of all those sorts of things, and it isn't a problem, you know.
Yeah.
But if you try to explain us in terms of those things, then it seems either your criteria don't work, they don't cover all the bases, or you have to somehow reduce or distort, us,
Yeah.
what you're applying the criteria to in order to make it fit. So it's Procrustean bed, as it were.
Yeah.
You chop off, and yeah, so all that qualitative stuff. I mean, someone sent me a link for a book they've written where they're trying to explain something like free will and survival. And I just read the blurb, and I don't remember the fellow's name, but he said he theorized for something that he called qualions, which I can only imagine sort of like, tachyons or something like, so some
Yeah.
other thing that is supposed to be somehow responsible for that. But I all the stuff like value, and you're not gonna, it's not there. There's not a neuron for
Yeah.
that. It's we grasp those sorts of things with some other faculty.
Yeah.
Um, so Plato, maybe, you don't have to be a Platonist to understand, a kind of strict academic Platonist to understand that there's a higher world. There's a world that's like it's somehow, what do you want to call it, a world of meaning,
Yeah.
significance.
Yeah. And
I always I always have the example of the sunset. I look at a sunset, I'm particularly susceptible to them, and I feel a sense of awe. But what's really happening is, radiomagnetic wavelengths of different frequencies. Well, why the
yeah.
hell aren't we able to just see that, rather than
Yeah.
see glorious yellows and bursting reds and strange kind of strange tints that are slightly purple and slightly something else? I mean, why don't we just say, oh yeah, that's that frequency, that's that frequency, that's like, why should that frequency and why should that frequency have a kind of,
Feeling
it's
that
not just
goes with it,
psychological,
or
it's not
yeah.
just psychological, but I feel it's actually has the value that I'm experiencing. I feel is actually there, present in it in some way.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's sort of like your discussion of the transcendental function, right? I mean, like
mm,
humanity has this ability to grasp things that are beyond the obvious in the realm of the numinous. And is that actually a connection to the divine? I mean, that's the question we always wrestling with, right? And there's probably
well,
no
I
way
mean,
to.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it all depends, but I mean, I personally, I talk about meaning and all that rather than divinity, or not to say that I don't have anything
Sure.
against divine, but it's just that to me that leads in a certain way where it's like I try to keep it experiential. So I mean,
Sure.
I just, for me, I myself can't say that I've had an experience of a personal God, but I've had an
Yeah.
experience of the world seeming to be suffused with some kind of deep meaning, and just hovering on the edge of communicating it to me, and it, giving me the sense that there is something at stake. There
Yeah.
is something of significance, here now,
Yeah.
and it's precious in some way. So that you could say divine in that way, but
Yeah.
it's a kind of yeah, it's if you put it this way, you usually see everyday reality and we compare it to a book. I mean, it's a story, same sorts of things happen, but
Hmm.
behind all the things happening, there's a narrative, there's a story. So it all kind
Yeah.
of makes sense. in those moments to me, somehow that is transfigured onto the world in some way. So somehow I might not know what the exact story is, but I get a sense that there is a story. There is
There's a
somehow,
connective theme running through it that is making it all hold together.
some way. And different individuals throughout history have had a glimpse of it, and some more than others, and some have communicated in some ways and all that. And all of these things in some way are brief, little glimpses of this what do you, Gebser calls it origin. I can call it presence. Whatever overarching theme. I guess I call meaning, but that's
that's what I was referring to with divinity. I'm not sure about the fact there is a God as we've commonly conceived it. A lot of times when I mention God, I'm thinking of the all. I mean, I guess, and that sort of fits with Gebser's source. And I mean, it's such a loose and nebulous idea, but it somehow it resonates. So whatever we do with that.
No, I mean, I agree. It's a sense of some totality, or sort of the bigger picture. The bigger picture. We tend to see things around us immediately, and in each of us, what should we say? I was going to say we all have to, or we should take our own personal trips up Mount Ventura, like Petrarch did.
Exactly.
And get that big picture, because then you can kind of see where things are connected. I mean, that's one of the problems is that that just sounds like a cliche, but it actually is. You can't take it in isolation. We what should we say? We can abstract, or we can just in order to discuss something, we can isolate it, put it in brackets, but it isn't in reality. It's, so I can say, well, let us, consider the glass and forget about everything else. But the glass, somebody made the glass, the material for the glass came from someplace. There's a whole history of, glassware. Who was the first person who used something in his hand to, drink the water? So that, there's a wonderful line from this Russian philosopher, Peter Uspensky, who was best known as being a student of a disciple of Gurdjieff, but he was a brilliant philosopher and
thinker in his own right.
In his own right. And it was during a time, this is in a chapter in his book called New Model of the Universe, and it's called Experimental Mysticism. And he doesn't say in the book itself, it's most likely he was experimenting with nitrous oxide and other stuff. And this is 1905 in St. Petersburg, so it's a while ago. But he says at one point that he was sitting on his couch and he's smoking a cigarette, and he was tapping the cigarette into the ashtray, and he suddenly, the whole history of the ashtray came to him. Like, it was made of copper. Where did the copper come from? Who smelted it? Who invented metallurgy? Who discovered tobacco? How did it get? And he said it all came to him, and these weren't mystical facts. These are actual, these
reality,
everyday facts that you could go look up. But it all came to him in a flash, and he said he wrote down, what the essence of the experience was, and the next day he read what he wrote, and he had written, "A man can go mad from one ashtray." So it's the sense that everything is connected, but in a way we edit it out because we would overload.
Exactly.
So, but the thing is, we edit it out too well. We do too good a job of it, so that not so much we edit out now that it seems completely meaningless. Oh, that's just the glass.
We've stripped the profundity out of it because we focus on the pragmatism of just doing, right?
Exactly. So it's not like it's not a sin, or we're completely damaged. It's an evolutionary over adaptation. It's an adaptation that works too well. So we can learn how to repair that in some way. So I do believe we can consciously alter that. And all the spiritual traditions are about that, and meditations about that, and in different ways they're all sort of about that in some way. They're all about making that kind of change, and taking over more control is, what's the right word, but more immediate, active control over our own consciousness, and allowing more of the reality that's being edited out in.
And
just as Uspensky looked at the ashtray, you could, I mean, I know myself, if you're feeling bored and you have a glass of wine or something, suddenly everything suddenly looks a lot more interesting. 5 minutes earlier, it was like, oh, I haven't looked at that picture in a while, and sort of thing. So that left brain, take care of business kind of character is relaxed.
Yeah.
And you do that and more, more the element. Talking about the divine, that's what William James, he said, it's alcohol releases the great yea saying. It's it's our access to the divine. Of course, too much lands you in the gutter, but
yeah.
it's yeah. So I mean, it's all there, but it's sort of mapping it out and learning, some way of getting some sense of direction.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm only now a little bit. I'm the wrong end of 60s. I'm only now starting to realize, oh yeah, actually it is kind of, and if you do that, that does sort of happen. So
Yeah.
it's I hope whatever time I have left, I'm able to make use of that, profit from these insights. But it takes a while.
Yeah. That's one thing. I mean, we're about out of time, and I really appreciate your hour. So again, thank you for that. But it sort of brings me back to that idea that I've had before, that a lot of what the mystic traditions suggest, like you were just saying, is an internal journey where we kind of go into ourselves and figure out how to, like you were just saying, have a richer experience that's less surface level or whatever. But how do we make a societal change when things like materialism have ended us up in such an awful place environmentally and in other ways? I mean, because then you start to get into, you can't make people have spiritual experiences, and you can't make them value meaning over practicalities. So what do we do if we want to get more to a place where that's more valued as a society?
Well, I guess I don't know. I guess you can only work on yourself, really.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Maybe it sounds pompous. Maybe set an example in some way. Teach by example. But we each of us have enough in our own backyard to deal with. I mean, one of the people I've written about, Manuel Swedenborg, the great Swedish scientist, later became a mystic in his later life. He has a great one-liner. He says, "Do the good that you know." So rather sit at home fretting, okay, what is the good? Is it, oh, it's relative. Is it really good? Like, okay, do the dishes, or
Yeah,
sweep the floor, take out the trash. There's a Buddhist saying, talk doesn't cook the rice. So it's like there's always something around you, and it doesn't mean you have to limit it to that. But as I said, oftentimes, we can feel the urgency of needing to do something to change things, but it could be the case. Oftentimes, the things that you do to try and change could have after effects that you don't know. You haven't factored in. You don't know what that's going to do. So there isn't any easy answer to this. But all I can say is try to lead as conscious a life as you can. Be very patient with others who are just as asleep as you. You are
exactly right. Yeah.
very patient with them, and that's a difficult thing to learn over time too. And human beings are very resilient. Humanity has come back at different times in its course from near disaster or disaster and all that. So I mean, I'm not aware of all the things, and I do believe Gebser knew what he was talking about when he talked about the breakdown. And it's not a picnic, and there's no guarantee that this integral structure, which is the next one that he posited emerging, there's no guarantee that it will set in. He believed evidence for it was there, here and there, sporadically. He's writing this in the 50s and 60s and all that. Is there now for it? I would say there is. I would say, the wide grassroots interest in different kinds of spirituality, to me, suggests. I mean, there's a lot of it is, of course, there's a lot of stuff that's just silly and crazy and all that. But at the same time, there's a lot that isn't. And there are a lot of serious people. As we were saying earlier, even something that seems on the surface so preposterous and wacky as some of the UFO sort of stories, they seem to, lead to changes in people's lives that have beneficial effects. So maybe, maybe it is something like that. I mean, I am a firm believer that you have to make change within yourself before you can, really effective change out in the world. So that puts me on that side of the fence, I guess. So
Excellent, sir. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your work and taking the time. So